Kia ora e te whānau. Welcome to the New Zealand Institute of Building, and we have our Industry Insights. This is our third Industry Insights. We are now into March 2023. We've had guests so far. We've had December 2022, we had Amy Marks from the States, and we had Daryl Patterson, who's from Australia, in our February one. Hey, Industry Insights is where we get interactive. We have had a lot of international guests. The other things we like to do is connect national experts. So that's what we're doing today. We've got Sam Archer in Auckland, and we've got Antonia Reid here in Wellington with myself. I'm Pamela Bell from the Institute of Building, and we're just going to have a great conversation around resilience, around green, around sustainability in buildings, and around carbon jargon. We've got a lot of questions in that space. Luckily, most of them are lined up in Slido. And if you've got some questions and you're watching us live, then please enter your code. You can see that at the bottom of the screen. It's 1383650. So that'll get you going. All right, let's just get here we go. I'm going to introduce our guests, and then they're going to tell you in more human language exactly what they do in their day-to-day jobs. So we've got Sam Archer, the Director of Market Transformation at the New Zealand Green Building Council. Sam, tell us about what you do.
Thanks very much, Pam. So I prefer technical director, as we were discussing earlier. It's a little bit pompous, that title of mine. So I am the technical director at Green Building Council, so I'm responsible for essentially the certification schemes that we run. So we run a bunch of sustainability certification schemes for buildings, both for existing buildings and for new buildings. And I think topically we're going to be talking about this a little bit, but we are doing quite a lot of work around climate change adaptation, around making our buildings more resilient. And so our certification schemes are very much putting that front and center at the moment.
Awesome. And just because we've got lots of people from the built environment on board, can you just remind us the names of those certification schemes?
Thank you for asking. So we run a tool called Homestar, which is for homes, we're probably around 10% of new building consents in terms of certifications for homes. Do a lot of work with Kāinga Ora. All their homes are certified with us. And then Green Star, which is more for commercial buildings, non-domestic commercial buildings. And again, I think we registered around 80 commercial buildings last year with that scheme. So it's going great guns.
Awesome. And Antonia Reid, our Policy Director at Building for Climate Change at NB, our Ministry of Business, Innovation and Employment. Tell us about what does this role mean?
Kia ora, Pam. My role is part of the Building for Climate Change program. So that program has been going at NB for a couple of years, and basically we're responsible for leading government thinking and advice to government on how do we address climate change through our building and construction sector. And we've got two focuses to that. So some of it is about reducing emissions from buildings, and then the other part is about adaptation and building resilience. And so my day-to-day job is basically around connecting with stakeholders, leading some of the thinking, and then giving advice to ministers on what they should do.
Nice. And I'll be the first to say there's lots of big words in there: adaptation, resilience, all that good stuff. So now I think we need to dig into kind of what those things really mean. So let's first of all jump to the obligatory ad break. Hey, at the Institute of Building, we've got our digital community conference coming up at the end of March, 23rd of March at Te Papa here in Whanganui Atara in Wellington. So for those who haven't already registered, I think we're over 200 registrations, so we've just got about 50 spots left. So there you go, bit of scarcity for you. Speaking of scarcity and things to make you act pretty quickly, obviously our thoughts go out to anyone who's been impacted by Cyclone Gabrielle in the last few weeks, and I think that New Zealand being 2 degrees of separation, it's pretty tough to have anyone who hasn't got a personal friend who's currently affected. I've certainly got friends digging out the Epijoa Farm right now in Puketapu Valley in Hawke's Bay, so my heart goes out to them. Hey, I'm going to go first of all to Antonia here. Seeing as you're well placed within NB, what are we hearing that we need to be doing in the face of events like this, and specifically around Cyclone Gabrielle?
Yeah, so I mean, I guess just to first of all echo what you said, like this is really tough for a lot of people, and we know that there are people who are dealing with a lot of uncertainty, a lot of really really tough stories about the damage that's been to the land or their buildings, etc. And so, a lot of the immediate work from government is really around that immediate response and recovery. With an MB, not me, but some of my colleagues are obviously involved in things like rapid building assessments to determine whether buildings need to be red or yellow stickered, or are they safe. Also work across MBs and things like temporary accommodation, and then across government, really a lot of work going on in terms of all of those immediate services and supports for people. So that's all still very much live, and we know there are still people right in the middle of that. In terms of a couple of practical things it's useful to know about, so MB has published some guidance on our website, which is around some of the kind of key things you need to think about with remediation and repair. So if you go to building.gov.nz, it's right on the home page, and there's information there about what are the things you need to think about with flood damaged buildings. In particular, what do you need to think about if there's been damage to plasterboard or wall linings, when are the times when you need a building consent, and what are the exemptions, and some thinking about slope stability and what you might need to do. So there's some resources there which are really designed to give people a bit of a pointer in terms of those key first things they might need to be thinking about if a building has been damaged.
Great. So this is aimed at both homeowners and building environment practitioners.
That's correct.
Yeah, great. And Sam, from your perspective, is there something you want to add in there?
Yeah, I guess for me it's about learning lessons from past flooding events. How often do we see on the TV that somebody points out, well, this is what it flooded 2 years ago, and the latest floods it's gone up by this amount or whatever, and that we need to be putting much more investment in that long-term 6-month, 2-year long kind of thing around raising the electrics, raising the plumbing, potentially raising buildings where we can, doing that community resilience piece, and having those community resilience plans in place, all that kind of stuff that are much more kind of long-term issues rather than just dealing with with obviously the day-to-day stuff that needs to be dealt with right now.
Yeah, and the really large conversations, long-term conversations about relocation, which are really similar to our coastal conversations as well, right?
Absolutely.
At a regional government level.
Yeah.
So that'll be really critical, because just raising buildings is a really still only a short to medium term solution, isn't it? From what I've heard in terms of the anxiety levels of those particular homeowners. Yeah,
I mean, I guess there's sort of it's sort of obviously a really complicated space, but there's a number of sort of interlinked things. So you're beginning to see some of those conversations about, are there areas where we shouldn't build back, where there needs to be some kind of managed retreat. And there's also a conversation going forward about places where we put new buildings, and that if the building is in a place that is poorly suited, then there's only so much you're ever going to be able to do to mitigate against that. So the first decision is often where the building is. There can then be a level of decisions around how do you manage that site and that location and that neighbourhood to help. And there are a range of examples, as I understand it, from Auckland, where some good flood management strategies or water management strategies really helped. So there were some areas that came through really well because there had been some good design or thought put into how floodwater would be managed. Others where that wasn't the case. So series of decisions around that wider neighbourhood site location.
So that's more urban landscape.
And the infrastructure that supports that. And then there's the decisions about the building itself and what you can do to mitigate if a flood does happen. And that's where I think, Sam, you were talking about things like, do you raise floor levels, do you raise electric sockets or heat pumps or things like that to prevent them from being damaged. So there'll be things that we can think about there as well.
Of course, and the complexity and scale of this wicked problem, if you like, which comes down to the scale of the individual building and some of those solutions you were providing, Sam. I hope that we're going to get the leadership and coordination in that space, and that we can improve on the learnings from Canterbury. So it'll be great to see how local and central government coordinate in that space. And I think, as with the earthquake response, industry is kind of willing and ready to get going. So it's just a matter of getting unpacking that complexity and getting the sequencing of what happens first. I guess there's a couple of things that came out of that conversation. One is about intensity, and that's not the right word, but density is probably a better word. I've noticed in the press that the flooding has become a catalyst for some people to bring back that old conversation around how do we do density. I know I've got some opinions around that, but I'm much more interested in, Sam, what do you think the connection is, or do you think we should change the trajectory that we're on, which is to become a more dense?
Yeah, I think it's a real shame that the conversations have been so much around density, because it's not density per se that it's the problem, it's density in the wrong areas, right? So if you build density in flood-prone areas, you're going to have problems. But I do think we do need to be having a conversation about doing density better. In my view, we don't have rules in place enough around making sure that when you do density, that you're not covering it in complete concrete and exacerbating some of those issues. I mean, typically within local plans, councils have exemptions around small bits of infill, but when you add those all up with lots of concrete, you end up with problems. And so I do think that we need to be thinking much more around making our density much more permeable, and thinking about green roofs and all the other things that can soak up some of these storm events in ways that we're not currently doing.
All right, I absolutely hear you. I'm just looking at our Slido, and I think we've covered off pretty much what we were going to cover there. Did you have anything else to add into that density intensity conversation?
I think Sam's kind of nailed it, that it's really around how you do density and make sure we've got the right things in place to enable it to be done well. And I think there are examples, as I said, where good design principles have enabled flood waters to be managed well. So it's possible.
Yeah, so the sequencing is getting the urban design and the landscape features first, and then the right density in the right place at the right time.
Yeah, yeah.
I think getting to that scale of the sustainable building, and that most of us are wanting to know, what is it that we can do now? What is it that we can do today to prepare for tomorrow? Sam, can you tell us a little bit around what are our main considerations when thinking and planning to be building more sustainably?
Fantastic question. Yeah. So, we, as you mentioned, those buzzwords of climate change adaptation and mitigation. So we've talked a little bit about adaptation, haven't we? We talked about more intense rainfall and so on. And clearly there are some things we can do around that, around better urban drainage, more what we call water sensitive design, which is working in tandem with nature and having more permeable surfaces and planting more trees, all of that kind of stuff. The one we really haven't talked about, which is kind of interesting one at a building level, is overheating. So we've had a really terrible summer, which hasn't been very hot, but actually what climate change suggests is that we are going to get much hotter summers. We're building more density, as we've been just discussing. In denser buildings, apartment buildings tend to be much more prone to overheating. And we've seen this where, density has been done a lot more in my native UK, for example. Overheating has been a real problem for the last 10, 20 years with apartment buildings we're designing. So it's great, I think, with building for climate change. Antonia, sorry, I'm stealing your thunder a bit, but, I think overheating is being thought of by MB. Certainly, it's being thought of by us. So in Homestar, the scheme that we run, you need to demonstrate that your home is not going to overheat when you design a new building under the scheme. So that's climate change adaptation. And then climate change mitigation, we need to be on a trajectory to have our buildings be, our new buildings, especially carbon zero over the next 8 to 10 years, really. We need to get from where we're building now, which is building buildings which are still pretty highly carbon intensive, to buildings that are very low carbon. And really that's split into two parts. So that's the carbon emissions associated with the products and materials that actually go into the building, the concrete, steel, wood, aluminium, all those kind of materials, they have a carbon footprint, and then actually reducing the carbon emissions of the building in operation. So that's, you know, making the building more efficient, so insulation and thinking about windows and so on. But it's also a big one that I'm very interested in is fuel switching. So we're still installing lots and lots of new gas boilers in our homes. We're still putting, well, actually, when I talk to the consultant communities in commercial buildings, it's becoming less and less common now to put gas boilers in commercial buildings, thank God, because people have realized that the kind of writing's on the wall for fossil fuels. So yeah, so getting rid of fossil fuels from our buildings. So, and then the last kind of couple from me would be, you know, it's all very well building a low carbon building, but you also need to make it healthy. As somebody once pointed out to me, you know, a tent is probably a very low carbon building, but you probably don't want to live in one for a very long time. You know, so you need to be thinking about good ventilation and the products and materials you're using. Are they you know, low emitting materials and so on. And then finally, responsible sourcing of those materials. So making sure the timber you use is from, you know, a responsible forest and so on. So those are really the sort of key things that we look at when we're looking at sustainable buildings from the certification schemes that we run.
And I like that you managed to bring in your weekend camping trip in there one way or another, in regards to the tent. Yeah, I mean, it's so complex, and I think this is the thing that we're trying to deconstruct for our members and the folks who are tuning in today, really, which is how do I make a start? I mean, if you were just going to make a start at the most simplistic level, Sam, what would that be? And then I'll ask Antonia about what the regulatory support or levers are around it.
Sure. Look, I can't answer that question without giving a bit of a pitch for the sustainability rating tools that we run, because I think one of the issues that we've had in New Zealand for a long time is people kind of going at themselves and going, well, you know, I've made my building sustainable because I've done X. But actually what we really need to do is coalesce around a kind of nationally agreed standard. This is what we mean by sustainable buildings. And I think NZGBC has done a good job, you know, blowing our own trumpet in setting those standards. So, you know, you've got some guidance there with the submission guidelines that we put together for Homestar and Green Star to say, if you do this, then you're getting in the right direction. I'll probably use that as a sort of excuse to then segue to Antonia, because particularly around carbon emissions and water consumption, you know, ultimately we need regulation because we need everyone to be doing this. And you know, that's really where building for climate change comes in.
Okay.
Sounds like a pass over to me.
Okay, your spot.
So yeah, so the government's got a number of things in train at the moment through the Building for Climate Change program, and I'll do a little bit of a pitch on these. So very much as Sam outlined, there's some thinking on adaptation we've already covered, and then there's reducing emissions, and we frame that around the operational emissions. So that's the emissions you use when running a building, the heating, the electricity, etc. And then the embodied carbon, so that's the emissions and all of the building materials that go into the building. And if I take those two one by one, we've kind of got things underway that we're thinking about in both of them. So in terms of operational emissions and the way you use a building, the government last year gave sort of a high-level policy agreement to introduce energy performance ratings for existing buildings. So we're now currently doing some of the detailed work to bring that in to introduce that into a new part of the Building Act. But
how will we be using these energy ratings in our everyday lives?
The idea would be that for building owners, and you'd start with larger buildings, probably commercial buildings and public buildings, and larger residential buildings, you would need to get an energy performance rating for that building, and that rating, so this would be a new requirement, but it's very similar to what already exists at the moment through the Neighbours NZ.
This is what's called operational energy,
and that would be essentially giving you information about the performance of your building, the energy it uses, and the efficiency of that, and that importantly, I think that information being available then to people who want to buy that building or want to lease that building, so they can make more informed decisions about what are my energy bills going to be, what's this building going to be like to live in. So it gives that more transparency about what energy is. It also helps the building owner to see, well, if I make these kinds of changes or decisions, then I could actually improve the energy
And that
efficiency.
helps us move to more global standards, doesn't it? Because when you walk past a real estate window in a European country, there are the energy use stats. Just like when you go to purchase a car, there's a fuel use sticker on the windshield.
Yeah,
All the same.
that's right. So it's similar to
Via the
there's
US.
similar things in the UK and in Australia.
So it's
So it'll
really
be introduced
consumer
exactly like that. Yeah.
Yeah.
So that's one part. The other part is thinking about new buildings and how do we encourage people to be designing those buildings with reduced energy, improving the operational efficiency of the building, to use our technical jargon. And so some of your members might be aware, a couple of years ago, we published a framework which set out a proposed approach, and that was basically around, first of all, introducing requirements to measure and assess the emissions of the building, and that's at the design stage or pre-building consent, and then over time to introduce a cap on emissions. So you would have to design a new building with in mind how much energy it's going to use, how efficient is it. So with that bit of work, we signalled that in the government's emissions reduction plan last year, and we're currently doing some of the work to design that, and we'll be looking to do some public consultation so people can have some feedback into exactly what that would look like.
Can you give us a little indicator of rough time frame?
So time frame for that is this year. Some of it's a little bit dependent on ministers and decisions, but yeah, we're aiming to do that consultation.
So people can expect the rules won't change this year, but the opportunity to be part of the solution will happen this year.
That's the plan at the moment. Yeah.
Cool.
So that's the key pieces we're doing around that operational energy. In terms of the embodied carbon, so there are a couple of factors that sort of contribute to how much carbon you've got embodied in the building. So some of that is actually around the materials that you use, and but it's also in terms of the way how efficiently you design something. So not just are you using concrete versus timber, but how is your design one which is sort of maximizing your building while minimizing the materials that you need to make it, if that makes sense. So there are a range of choices that can be made, and some of the choices are things like, do you need a new building to start with, or can you repurpose or reuse a building? When we're thinking about embodied carbon, we think about the whole life of the building. So what are the material? What's the emissions that went into making the materials in the first place? And then how often are you going to need to repair or replace those, and over what life cycle, and then what happens at the end? So there are choices all along the way in terms of, do you start with a new building, or can you repurpose one? Do you design something that can be reused or can be more flexible or adaptable in the future? Another part of it is to do with the waste that's generated. So not just what materials you use, as I said, but we know that there's a pretty high proportion of building materials that never actually make it into the building.
We have a terrible statistic, something like 40%, don't we?
Yeah, and it may be different for different particular materials, but are there ways that you can, for instance, design to use a standard panel size that means you're not, creating a half a panel that gets wasted, or a standard window size that means it's more efficient and you're reducing emissions
now you're
along the
talking
way.
language, Antonia.
Just to give a plug, off-site manufacturing and prefabrication, often you can get some efficiencies there in terms of
sounds good.
that. So anyway, I feel like I'm talking too much, but I had a little more to say about embodied carbon. Do you want me to keep going?
Well, I think let's frame it up in this carbon jargon space. So just move that slide on, because lots of people are super overwhelmed. You talk about embodied carbon and operational carbon because it's second nature, but I think there's still some understanding that we need to clarify around when do we use embodied and when do we use operational, but without spending too much time on that, because if embodied is life cycle from woe to go and operational is in use, I think carbon seems to be the place that we keep coming back to for measurement. And that lovely word of measurement keeps coming up, because at the end of the day, we all want to know, am I a good, sustainable construction person or a not so good one, as if it's a binary decision, when of course it's this very long continuum. But can you just dig in a little bit around the measurement aspect, around how do we do carbon counting? And Sam, you might know where people can start. Is there a carbon calculator that is a go-to one? Because I know some people have offered up different options online, and we would like to point people to where they can go to start looking at how would I start counting carbon if it was part of my procurement strategy, if it was being asked for in the way we contract. And of course, we want to do these behaviour shifts before we have to, don't we? So how do we incentivise and encourage each other? I imagine it starts with some type of common language. But
yeah, that's right. So I mean, one of the issues that we and MB have been trying to solve is, particularly for embodied emissions, is agreeing on what it is that you're counting. So, you know, if you were building a supermarket, do you include just the emissions that went into the products and materials for the building itself, or also the car park, the lighting, the roadways that went into it? Do you include all of those life stages that Antonia was talking about, or is it just what we call the upfront emissions? So that's just the emissions associated with just making those products rather than replacing them. Do you include the end of life emissions and all that kind of stuff? So it's really important that we all agree on a common measurement approach. And so, you know, I'd like to think that we have been kind of working with MB and brands and other people in agreeing on that kind of common language, Pat. And we won't get it completely right. You know, there'll still be some differences here and there, but I think it is important for us all as an industry to work together on that. For homes, we now have a dedicated calculator that we developed with brands called the Homestar Embodied Carbon Calculator, or HEC. So that's available on our website. So if you are building homes, you know, it's a very simple kind of drop-down spreadsheet that will enable you to look at your embodied emissions from a home you're building. Similarly, for operational emissions from homes, we've got an online calculator called Echo, which we do a 2-day course that enables you to learn how to do that kind of that operational emissions calculation. For operational emissions for commercial buildings, it does get quite specialist. So typically in our projects, so all of our Green Star projects, you would be required to do that analysis, so analyzing the operational carbon emissions, and typically that's done with quite sophisticated energy modeling software and using energy modeling professionals. I mean, I think that's going to be an interesting question for MB ultimately, is how specialist this kind of stuff gets for building code, because it can get quite specialist quite quickly, and I think we feel very much for homes that particularly as that sector is not as specialist as commercial buildings, that we probably need simpler tools and so on. So yeah, so there are tools already out there, but we all need to be thinking about how we develop those tools for the wider, broader industry, not just the kind of those at the leading edge, I suppose, which is probably the guys that we deal with more.
Yeah, and one thing to point people to is, and this goes to Sam's point around that sort of common language. We published just over a year ago methodology for whole of life embodied carbon. So that's available on the building.gov.nz website. And the idea behind that is that provides that common language of these are the kinds of things that should be considered when you're measuring the embodied carbon across the life of the building. So regardless of what tool you're using, and we do know there are lots of tools out there, and there might be different tools that suit different buildings or different purposes, the methodology is aiming to say this is a consistent sort of bottom line.
Okay.
We're looking at and are close to having a similar methodology for the operational emissions as well.
Okay.
So those two then should be able to give people a bit of a sense of this is what you should be looking for in a tool. And these are the kinds of basic things that you need to be thinking about.
Okay.
Yeah.
So in this interesting space, grey space that we're in right now, before we are being asked to provide this information as part of the consent process, what are the steps or the things we can do, and how do we explain or influence the benefits of using them? You know, for our clients, or whether it's in-house and we want to start getting some practice in how we use things. I mean, how do you talk about the reasons for starting to capture this carbon information before we're actually regulated to use it?
So I guess there's, the first point, I guess, is to acknowledge that there's a real spectrum in terms of knowledge there, and we sort of appreciate that, and capability, and frankly headspace for small businesses, or for people who aren't so familiar with this. So people will all be at different points in terms of their carbon literacy. But in terms of thinking about what are the benefits, or why to start thinking about this. So what we know is that there is a real interest and appetite from people in this space. So I know brands did some work last year talking to industry people about what does the sort of future workforce for the building industry need to look like in terms of climate change. And a big theme for that was that people wanted to know more about this, and they just needed to know where to start. Mm-hmm. So some of it is around familiarizing yourself with the tools and the methodologies or information that is available. Yeah. Looking at sort of examples of buildings that are doing this well. Mm-hmm. And then there is probably this two-way conversation between the clients or the people who are developing buildings and the designers and architects to sort of unpick where there are some kind of benefits. Mm. So sometimes you can have things that are a bit different or new, and therefore feel a bit harder, but actually have some real payoffs in terms of the health of the building, or its longevity, or the energy cost that it's going to have to run it. So sometimes it's around trying to find ways to kind of help surface those longer term benefits.
I think that's a really good point. And Sam, if you can speak to anything in there, and particularly around how do we assess where to get the best bang for our buck, basically, like how do we know where we'll get the most?
Before I answer that question, I think I've just answered that question about why developers and builders and construction companies should get on board. I just echo kind of some of Antonia's points, which is, look, it's coming like a freight train down the road, right? So get on board now, because within the next couple of years under building code, you're going to have to be accounting for the carbon in your building, both operationally and embodied. So much better to start getting trained up now and understanding the tools and the processes and what these mean right now. Just in terms of quantifying things, I think one really important point to get across is that you want to start, if you're planning a new construction project and you're interested in the carbon emissions from that building, it's really important to start early, because that's before all the major decisions have been made, and you have much more scope for making changes. So doing a basic embodied carbon assessment of the building and saying, where are my hotspots? Well, actually, if I'm building a residential house, then maybe it's the concrete slab is the big kind of bang for buck, and and then investigating potential alternatives. Maybe I can get hold of some lower carbon concrete from a different supplier, or I can think about a suspended floor rather than a concrete floor, and so on. So making those early decisions means doing some of those early stage calculations in a sort of more crude way allows you to kind of identify those hotspots.
Nice. I think getting in early, understanding the basic terms, getting our heads around some of our measurement methods, and identifying the hotspots is a good term too. I think that's really because of some of the fundamental questions are: should I even be building? Should I be knocking down? Is there a reuse opportunity here?
That's right.
Is the building the answer to my problem? What's my problem to solve? Which is one of my favourite kind of questions, which is, actually, is this a problem that has a construction answer, or is it a problem that has a myriad of other types of ways that we can address it?
I like that. And if I do decide that a building is the answer, how big does it need to be for what I need it to be? Mm-hmm. And am I thinking about what its future life is beyond my immediate use? So a building that's resilient and that lasts a long time has lower embodied emissions overall than one that you're going to
100%.
find is not what you need in 10 years' time.
There's a great Buckminster Fuller quote, which I'm not going to get right, but it talks about the percentage of time that we use, for example, our homes and our offices. And I understand that COVID's flipped that a bit, but of course it talks about the percentage of time that our living rooms are empty and that kind of thing. So there's a massive opportunity for reuse stuff there.
Pam, can I just make another quick point about this whole topic, really, which is around training? It's not the responsibility, I think, of the builders and developers and so on to be developing that training, but really, I think one of the lessons learned from the recent H1 changes is that there wasn't enough training from all of us, not just from MB, but from New Zealand Green Building Council and Brands and others. We really need to recognise that Antonia is quite right, that there's a big spectrum of people who are right on the beginning of the journey and other people who know a ton about this, and we just need to be really, really getting that training out there for people so they really understand those carbon issues and terms.
I think that's a really great point. And in terms of training, you've mentioned the Green Building Council, brands. Here at the Institute of Building, we have a really great resources tab on our website, and we also have a YouTube channel where things like this industry insights land. The other thing that we do is a seminar series called Building Legends, which has got an 80% focus on the problems today and a 20% on the future ones. So this is in that weird future today space, isn't it? The whole carbon, carbon jargon, carbon literacy, which is kind of a first step for people understanding how to make a move into producing more sustainable buildings. I wonder, just moving a little bit more into the climate resilience space, I think we've talked a bit about, permeable surfaces and urban design, sustainability design. So if we jump into building for the future a little bit more, I'm interested to understand, I guess, how we bring the future into today. I guess we talked a little bit around key dates, regulation. There was mention around a timeline PDF, and we've been talking each time about where to start. Can you tell us, Antonia, a bit more about what we might expect to see out of the building for climate change space?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
So the timeline PDF, so I'm making a real plug for the MB website, so I'm expecting traffic to go up a lot after this. So the Building for Climate Change page there, we've got a little one-page map, which is our program year by year out to 2050. So it's got the key bits of work we're trying to do, and I've touched on some already around embodied carbon and operational emissions. And obviously that's, some of it's still a bit indicative in terms of where things will land. Things that people can expect to see in the most immediate term. So the first one is some consultation on the next step with those operational and embodied carbon frameworks. So that's moving towards what are the requirements around reporting for new buildings, and over time, how should we introduce caps on emissions? So as I said, don't have a specific date yet, but we're looking to have that public consultation this year. And then the other thing I mentioned was changes to the Building Act. So I think I mentioned the changes around energy performance certificates. There's actually a couple of other changes that we're looking at in that space. So one,
is this because the space will forever be changing, so we're just going to be continually updating?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's, as governments and government officials, we're always looking at what are the things we can improve, and so
so we should expect constant change.
Well, I think one thing I guess I'd say is that from my point of view, we changed the Act, and that's the bit I focus on. But in terms of what people need to be worrying about, some of it then has a transition period. So I wouldn't want people to think it's all going to change overnight. So the changes to the Act will then, be phased in. But in addition to those energy performance certificates that I mentioned before, the other things that we're looking at is requirements around waste minimisation. And I think we've already talked a bit about how designing out waste can be really good from a climate change point of view. And then we're also looking at some changes which basically just make it really clear that adaptation and climate resilience are important in terms of thinking about buildings in the Act. So that's particularly relevant given the recent events. That it doesn't mean any immediate change, but what it does is it just says that in the Building Act, and when you're thinking about all of the things you have to do to comply with the Building Act, adaptation and the resilience of the buildings is something that you need to be thinking about.
Yeah.
Which means then, you know, as we work through some of those things we talked about, what are the things to make buildings more resilient? That's the sort of hook to hang that off.
Okay.
So those are the kind of two things, the sort of public consultation and some changes to the Act. Yeah.
We can see things moving and changing in that space. Sam, what's moving and changing and coming up for you in terms of building for the future? What do we know about, need to know about that's happening at the Green Building Council?
Yeah, great question. Yeah, so I think the big one for us would be moving to much more towards our tools being net zero carbon. So we are currently working on a big update to Green Star, which is our commercial buildings tool. And for that, really, we're moving to a point, you know, over the next 5 years where you won't get a Green Star rating unless you can prove that the building is net zero carbon. And so a lot of the work that I'm doing at the moment with different experts from around the country is around how you define net zero carbon and what that all means. It's pretty tricky for us, given that, you know, we have a very low carbon grid. So I think a lot of that's going to be around electrifying buildings and making them extremely energy efficient. Yeah,
you're talking about operational energy here.
Sorry, talking about operational carbon. That's right. Yeah.
Cool.
Oh, sorry. But the net zero would also include embodied as well.
Embodied as well.
Yeah, and that's the tough nut to crack. So what we're seeing at the moment is that, you know, typically you might be able to get a 15-20% reduction on business as usual. That's readily achievable with products and materials available now. But we need to get to 100% reduction in embodied carbon, really, if we're going to do it right. And so that needs the products and materials industry to come to the table and develop the very low carbon concretes and the very low carbon steels and so on. So that's big technological changes we need to see from the industry as well.
And you talked about the carbon zero goal being in the 8 to 10 years. Are you thinking that's a voluntary move, or are you expecting a regulatory stick to come to the fore in the next 8 to 10 years?
Oh, no, what I meant by that is our tools will be requiring that. So,
so you'll be moving ahead of the curve.
Yeah, that's right. So what we try as much as possible is to align with government regulations so that we can say we're 2, 3, 4 years ahead of where government is heading. And that means that you can use Green Star or Home Star to start getting on the journey early.
Great. And we are seeing some really good pickup at local and central government level around the residential tool, the Home Star 6-star one. I'm involved with a local government controlled entity that develops social housing in the broader Wellington region, and it's Urban Plus, and they've got the 6-star.
That's right, and
coming through local government, so that seems to be very well spread.
Yeah, that's right. And for commercial buildings, for any non-domestic buildings that government's developing, you know, libraries, new hospitals, and so on, there's the government carbon neutral government program, which is driving the requirement for Green Star through that as well. So we're seeing a big uptick in kind of public buildings that are going through Green Star as a result of that.
Okay, we've mentioned waste a few times. I know it's not the sexiest topic in the sustainability folder, but I am really interested to understand how on earth are we going to do better measurement in that waste space? What kind of incentives are we going to start to see through the consenting process? I know that's a live topic at local government level, and potentially even who might we be looking to offshore, who's doing some really good waste measurement and incentivising through the consenting or permitting process.
Is that a question for me or Antonia?
I don't mind.
I think some elements of that are probably more my colleagues at the Ministry for the Environment. So I know they're doing a lot of work on waste at the moment in terms of thinking about waste infrastructure. So often it's especially when you get to the waste that you've already generated, it's around having the right infrastructure in place.
So that might be also another industry insight conversation.
Yeah, and then and then waste levies and the interaction with that.
Yeah.
From our point of view, the thing we're specifically focusing on is moving towards having waste minimisation plans as a requirement.
Okay.
And I guess as much as possible encouraging that to be about how do you design out waste early, rather than just dealing with it when you've got it.
Again, doing it early and potentially identifying waste as one of those hotspots. Sam, would you add anything else into the waste space?
Yeah, definitely. So for a long time, we focused on that kind of what do you do with the waste once you've made it kind of question. And in the big centres, particularly Auckland, there's really good infrastructure in place for taking your waste jib and doing something with it. But the reality, I think, is that New Zealand's a very long, thin country with lots of space in between the cities. And so, if you are producing a lot of waste jib in Invercargill, getting it all the way back up to the jib factory in Tauranga is probably not very viable. So I completely agree that we need to be refocusing from diverting waste once we've made it to actually just not making the waste in the first place. Really, that needs to be the focus of our efforts. Yeah.
Nice. Well, we've been running through some Qs and some As through Slido. So thanks to folks who have been engaging with the Slido app. We'll be wrapping up now. We'll just hit 12:45 and hoping to see people coming to our digital community event, which again is all about what we can do moving forward in terms of our digital tools and our collaborative community and how we do interoperability. And I guess in that digital space, we will also have Jason Howden setting up to chat with us next month in April. So that'll be really great. We'll make sure we get the dates and details out to everybody. So I just want to say thank you very much, Antonia, and thanks very much, Sam. It's been lovely to have you both here, and we'll see you all next time. Thanks for watching Industry Insights with the Institute of Building. Ka kite.
Thank you.